Great. Okay. Alrighty, so today we are going to start talking about, actually, hopefully finish. We might need to do a little bit on Monday. Um, talking about biological parts of things. Oh, why Zoom just did that? Zoom, I don't care. Sorry. Dr. Myers is not crazy, I swear. Not having a full conversation with Zoom. Alrighty. So hopefully gonna get through all of this and then real quick, let me bop over to Blackboard. Just so we're all on the same page about everything coming up. A week from today, you do not have class because I will be in Philadelphia for the conference I keep mentioning. But we do have class Monday and Wednesday next week. Well, actually, I think Wednesday next week is your exam day. And so give me a second here. Look our syllabus, just make sure again, everyone, including Dr. Myers, is on the same page with scheduling. Yeah, so we do have a discussion day on Monday. And then we have exam 3 on Wednesday. While y'all are doing your exam 3 thing, I will be assigning roles for our reaction to the past activity, which will start when I get back. Thanksgiving is like really late this year, so we actually have like a full week between me getting back, which is nice. Normally I get back, there's a day, and then it's like, bye, see you guys again in a while. So this will be nice to kind of like get everything going. And so just as a reminder, where do you find the exam? You're free to start it over the weekend if you'd like. Exam 3 is, sorry, like should be talking you through it. If you go to exams and then you go to exam 3, you've got the multiple choice and the short answers. And then here are the essays. All the prompts are here. And then if you click on it, you can submit it right there as well. Any questions about the exam or anything? So Monday, I will send out a little poll for like the types of things you'd be comfortable doing in the simulation in terms of like how active do you want to be? Are you comfortable arguing against your own beliefs? Things like that. Alrighty. I would say it'll be just like at the other exams where you have, I'll be in my office. If you have questions, feel free to stop by, but otherwise it is your day to do as you want. Yeah. I just figured like when I used to do them in class, you know, you had a day where you were like, you know, doing reading and lectures and things like that. So may as well give it to you when we're not in class. Alrighty, so this chapter kind of squeezes together two different perspectives on biological factors. And they are behavioral genetics and evolutionary psychology. You've already heard me give some critiques to evolutionary psych earlier in the semester. But again, I try to keep an open mind, and if you're really interested in ev psych, Dr. Martorell teaches a whole class on it, and I believe she'll be offering it next fall. So what is the difference here? Well, behavioral genetics is dealing with the possibility that individual differences in personality, a lot of what we've been talking about, right? With traits and things like that, those are due to genetics. Evolutionary psychology is aimed at general universals. So what are the basic genetic conditions of the species of humans, right? Of Homo sapiens sapiens, and how do those influence behavior? So like behavioral genetics is a little more like trait theory. Evolutionary psychology might be a little more like the biological equivalent to like Freud, right? Kind of saying like everybody has these things. So behavioral genetics attempts to explain how personality traits that differ among individuals are passed from parent to child and shared by biological relatives. It's not concerned with traits that are the same for everyone, like a need for food and water. It's like, that's just part of it, right? It's part of being alive. So can genes influence broad patterns of behavior? And broad patterns of behavior here is how they're defining personality traits. And if genes can influence personality traits, how? How are they doing it? There is a lot of controversy associated with behavioral genetics because of its past associations with eugenics and also with cloning. So the idea, eugenics, if you're not familiar, is the idea that humanity could be improved through essentially selective breeding. So eugenics thought, let's not let anyone with a mental illness or who's indigenous or who's a person of color or a whole host of other things procreate. So in eugenics, you had women going in for what they thought were routine procedures and finding out way later that their ovaries or even their whole uterus had been removed without their consent, or they'd signed a form but they didn't understand English, right? So they didn't know what it was. Of course, the person who believed in eugenics maybe most strongly was Adolf Hitler. And this is a really good example of science not being used for good, right? Like Hitler had scientists under him who were doing like really evil scientific studies on people. And this is a historical marker for Indiana that talks about eugenics and the eugenics laws. Technically, Virginia still has like a court decision in place that like we could have eugenics. It hasn't been exercised since the 70s, as far as we know. But it was exercised just like as the 70s, where people who were considered feeble-minded, people with mental illness or developmental delays, might be sterilized against their will. Modern research in behavioral genetics is not concerned with these types of issues. And partially because personality is determined by far more than just genetics, and behavioral genetics acknowledges that, right? I think I've said this before, but one of my professors in undergrads always said genes are expressed in an environment, right? So you need both. You need that gene environment interaction. So behavioral genetics is similar to any kind of genetic study. You want to compare the similarity in a trait, in this case personality, between people who are and who are not related, and people who are related to varying degrees. So the assumption here is that traits and behaviors that are influenced by genetics and by genes should be more similar among people who are more closely related, right? So if it's genetic, you should be much more likely to see among siblings or among parent-child than you would among like distant cousins. A lot of times this is done with twin studies. And so they look at the differences in monozygotic or MZ twins. These are identical twins coming from the same zygote. So back to basic reproduction, if we're all a little rusty. The zygote is what forms after the sperm and egg combine and cells start to multiply. And in some rare cases, that will split into two identical zygotes. And those will become two identical humans going through embryo fetus before their birth. Because they come from the exact same sperm and egg. Dizygotic or fraternal or DZ twins are 2 eggs were released and 2 sperm found those 2 eggs. So DZ twins are no more similar to each other genetically than any other set of siblings, but they've shared the same uterus, they share the exact same time frame and environment growing up. So what happens is by looking at the differences between MZ and DZ twins, we can take into account genes and also the environment. One of the big things that we ask in any kind of genetic study, whether we're looking at eye color or personality, is can the phenotype, which is your observable traits, things you can see and observe, can that be attributed to variation in the genotype or the gene structure? So one of the things that comes out of this and that's used to look at this is the heritability coefficient, or sometimes it's called the heritability quotient. And this is the percentage of the variance in this case, a personality trait that's controlled by genetic factors. So the can't say the word heritability today. The heritability quotient or coefficient is you take how related or correlated are the MZ twins, and you subtract how related or correlated are the DZ twins, and then you multiply it by 2. That's the whole formula. Obviously, this like sounds really easy, but in order to do this, you need to like find hundreds of sets of twins, right? And do these studies. I have a friend who had twins in Wisconsin, and she was like immediately contacted by the University of Wisconsin, like, can we get your twins and studies? And she was like, whoa. So people will do that. And so here is an example again, where you'd have pair 1, 2, 3, up to pair, I don't know, 2,000 sometimes when you have a lot of funding. And maybe the identical twins, the likelihood that both have something, right, is a correlation of 0.6. The likelihood that both have something for the DZ, those fraternal twins, is 0.4. So to calculate out this heritability coefficient, you use 0.6 minus 0.4, you get 0.2, and then you multiply that by 2, gives you 0.4. You translate that to a percentage. So the heritability of this particular trait is 40%. So 40% is determined by genetics, and 60% is determined by everything, the environment. And those percentages that were used in the example on the previous slide are the averages that we see when we look at various personality traits. So MZ twins do tend to correlate on things about 0.6. DZ twins tend to correlate with things about 0.4. So the average heritability coefficient ends up being 0.4 or 40%. And so genetics do definitely influence it, right? That's almost half of accounting for a personality trait, but we know that the environment still has a really big influence. When you do it in non-twin studies, so you just take non-twin relatives, maybe siblings, maybe parent-child, right? The heritability coefficients are lower. You're getting like 20% of it accounted for by genetics. And this suggests that the effects of genetics are interactive and multiplicative. Really interestingly, they'll sometimes do heritability studies where they look at adopted siblings who grew up in the same environment but share no genes. And that's only like 0.5 or 5%. So even though they're not genetically related, they're still, because humans are all genetically related way back in the day, right? And we're even like genetically related to animals like bonobo chimps that I think we share like 98% plus of their DNA, right? So what does this tell us? This tells us genes matter, but that not all personality comes from experience, but also not all personality comes from genes. And this talks a lot and helps us think about the etiology, which is a fancy word for where does it come from? of behavioral or mental disorders. So disorders that have higher heritabilities, we tend to say, yeah, those have genetic factors. Disorders that have low heritabilities are much more likely to be due to environmental factors. Insight into the effects of the environment on personality development can also be gleaned from this information. That having the shared family environment might not matter as much. This reminds me of a quote by Naomi Wolf, who's very problematic. Now, fully gonna acknowledge she's an anti-vaxxer. She's a TERF, which if you don't know what that stands for, it's trans-inclusive radical feminist. But she used to write very beautiful feminist texts, and one of the things she wrote about is she struggled with an eating disorder when she was an adolescent. And she has this beautiful line, I'm gonna have to paraphrase, where she basically says, like, all the support and the love that my family could give me did not matter when I walked out the door, right? And I walked into the outside environment, right? A lot of our lives are spent not in the home. And so we're influenced by a lot of other things, media, peers, things like that. So let's take a quick example here, maybe not surprisingly, since depression is one of the most common disorders. We have a lot more research on it. So depression has a known genetic component. Even like way back in ancient Greek times, they sort of recognized that this is passed down in families, even though they didn't have words for genes, right? And the genetic causes for depression have been studied in a whole bunch of different ways. So one is family pedigree studies. In these, you select the people with depression, you call those probands. These are the people you're focusing on in your study. And then you also take the genes of everybody else. And you can get people's genes like through blood, having like do a swab, spit into a tube like those Ancestry.com and all those genetic things that are now leaking your data everywhere. It's a little scary, right? Lots of ways to get it that are fairly non-invasive. And if depression's inherited, we should see higher rates in family members. So depression is in about 10 to 12% of the general population. What we find if you take a proband who has depression and you look at their relatives, about 20% of their relatives also have depression. So sort of double the general population, right? Suggesting there is some sort of higher risk. Twin studies, like we just talked about, we would expect the MZ twins to have a higher rate of both having it than the ZZ twins, and that's what we find consistently. So Sullivan et al. Did a quantitative review where they took a whole bunch of twin studies and combined the data. So they ended up with 21,000 twins in the study. And the identical or the MZ twins were twice as likely to both develop depression as the DZ or the fraternal twins. So in this case, 31 to 42% of the variants in depression seem to be genetic, also sort of around that 0.4 heritability we've been talking about. When they look at adoption studies, they'll look at adoptees and they'll look at their adoptive family, but also their biological family, their family of birth. One study found that biological parents of adoptees who, like, they've never interacted with their child, right? Their child was adopted at birth. But those biological parents had been hospitalized for depression. They were looking at adoptees who'd been hospitalized for depression. I want to make sure I'm clear on it. So they took the adoptees and they're like, this child has been hospitalized for depression. Let's find their biological relatives. And they found that they had a higher incidence of severe depression among those biological relatives who had never interacted with the adoptee. Another study found that depression occurred 7 times more often in the biological relatives of severely depressed adoptees than in biological relatives of non-depressed control adoptees. We also have gotten very granular looking at specific genes. One of the first psychologically related genes that they discovered was the 5-HTT gene. And this is related to serotonin or 5-HT in the brain. And people with depression often have an abnormality of this 5-HTT gene. So again, suggesting this is at least partially related, but because depression is complicated, there are likely several different genes implicated. So what are our conclusions here? Does the family matter? Think again about that adoptive sibling heritability rate of only like 5%. The extreme conclusion might be like, no, not at all. Developmental psychology would say, heck yeah, right? When we think about like attachment theory and all of that. The effects of doing parent training. So this is one way to treat mental illness in children, is actually to teach their parents to essentially help treat it. That works. That works really well. That works better than just doing therapy on the kiddo. And that says yes, that the family matters. Just technical issues, yes. Technical issues are like similarity among adoptive families. So if you have the same culture within an adoptive family, that reduces variability. Based on just behavioral observation, yes, families do impact things. But really interestingly, when you look at research based on self-report, the conclusion is no. In self-reports, though, people may focus more on traits that make them different from their family than the similarities. So that's something to think about. So how are genes affecting personality? Well, they're creating propensities to behave in certain ways, right? So it's not like this immediately makes you have this, right? It's like you have a genetic propensity to act in a certain way that's going to make other people interact with you in a certain way, right? And that is going to create these things we talk about when we talk about personality. One of the things that they do with this is looking at molecular genetics, so determining whether differences in traits are correlated with particular genes. This is called the association method. Interestingly, they've looked at this with things like being a member of the LGBTQ+ community. So most people who would identify as homosexual had the same gene on the X chromosome, but heterosexuals in their family did not. So it seems like people who are gay, lesbian, trans, etc., really are born this way, as Lady Gaga would say, right? Looking at behavioral and emotional control. There's a gene called the DRD4 gene. You don't have to know the specific gene, but it affects the development of dopamine receptors and therefore how people respond to rewards. And what they found is that people with too little dopamine or the inability to respond to dopamine crave extra stimulation. So these folks might be more sensation seeking, not emotionally regulated, seek out dangerous events to get the same sort of rush that we might get from like watching a good movie, right? Neuroticism and depression. There's a presence of a gene associated with decreased serotonin function, our 5-HTT gene. And we see stronger responses in the amygdala. So if you're like, oh, brain, I don't remember the brain parts. The amygdala is related to emotion and particularly fear. So there are stronger responses in the amygdala to fearful and unpleasant stimuli. It also seems to affect how much the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, which is the part right behind our forehead that helps us organize and plan and our personality and our emotions. And the amygdala response is much stronger in instances. So for example, they had people with social anxiety disorder. In the study, they said, you're going to have to give a speech. And we saw amygdala response being related to that. Cultural differences, interestingly. The allele that's related to neurotic responding is found more commonly in some cultures than others. And again, if you just think about like genetics, basically, it makes sense that like, if you have a lot of people with that, it'll just get passed on, right? There are some limitations though, not surprisingly. It's not applicable to everyone. And as I mentioned, these genes probably interact in really complex manners that we don't yet understand. So how are they affecting personality specifically? Well, we've got gene-environment interactions. There must be an environment for us to behave in, right? We're not in a vacuum. And environments can affect heritabilities. So we think about it psychologically, we know that like lack of intellectual stimulation or educational opportunities is correlated with lower IQs, right? Even though IQ is somewhat heritable. The most basic one though to understand this is, let's say you have a genetic propensity to be 6'4", but you're raised in an environment where you never have adequate access to nutrition. You might never reach your 6'4" heights, right? Because your body just can't get there. So even physical traits are affected by the environment. We know that genetic expression within the social environment can also be, so let's say you are that 6'4" person, you are adequately given nutrition, but you reach 6'4" in middle school, right? What do people who are really tall really early do? Right? They like try to slouch, not stick out, right? And then that's gonna affect you physically, right? You might have back and shoulder problems later in life. The choice of environment sometimes is going to be consistent with our genetic tendencies. So people who are sensation seeking, who need more excitement, they might choose to be involved in criminal activity or do things like, I don't know, a lot of skydiving or something like that. And we know that the same environment can affect different individuals in different ways. This is responses to being stressful, or just sometimes responses to boring experiences. Some of us will just ignore them, right? Whatever, stressful experience, whatever, I'm bored. Some people will engage in substance use to try to cope or make things more exciting. Some people will eat, right? You've ever just like gotten a snack when you're bored, even though you're not actually hungry, right? Yeah. And environments can determine how or whether a gene is expressed. And here we come back to Professor McFarland's statement that genes are expressed in an environment. So now we're moving on to evolutionary psych, and like once upon a time, these did have titles. So I'll try to go back in and get them in there. I'm not quite sure what happened. But so thinking about evolutionary personality psychology in particular, this is going to attempt to explain how patterns of behavior that characterize all humans originated in the survival value of those characteristics. So you're applying evolutionary theory to human behavior, not just human traits, like again, hair color, height, things like that. So the idea, basically, if we go all the way back to Darwin, right, is that characteristics that have more survival value, gonna help us live longer, be stronger, healthier, are going to be more likely to appear in subsequent generations, because the people in this case who have those survivability traits will be more likely to reproduce. But remember from our cultural lecture that that's not always necessarily true, right? There are some traits that just kind of like slip through. Some clear examples of adaptive traits that have non-adaptive traits that have just stuck around is the appendix, right? The appendix does have like a little bit to do with digestion, but like you can totally live without one, right? And every once in a while, the appendix will just decide, I'm gonna try to kill you, right? And explode, and people have to have emergency surgery. And yet it persists, right? You would think at some point that would have gotten screened out, but it doesn't. Susceptibility to cancer. We know that that runs in families, right? And people are starting to recognize that, for example, with breast cancer, where women who have the BRCA gene will choose voluntarily to undergo a mastectomy, a double mastectomy, to reduce their chances of getting cancer. So you would think again, like, why is that trait hanging around? Part of it's modern medicine, right? But part of it is genes are weird, right? Sometimes. And then my favorite is, so I had a friend who was an environmental science, earth environmental science major, who hated pandas. He was like, everybody thinks they're so cute. And we spend all this money trying to keep them alive, but like they don't want to keep themselves alive. So if you know anything about pandas, they have a carnivorous digestive system, but they only eat bamboo. And so like they don't retain, like a lot, like their poop is green because it's mostly just bamboo that they couldn't process. The other thing is pandas are not good at reproducing on their own. They like just won't. Right? So it's like my friend was like, why are we keeping them alive? And it's like, well, they're a symbol of, Chinese nationalism, but also of, efforts to help species survival. And it is sort of interesting to think about like why nature, right? Why? What you're doing in evolutionary personality psychology is identifying common behavior patterns and then looking back and being like, why was that particular behavior adaptive? Why would that have been selected for? One of the big things that evolutionary psychology loves to look at for some reason is mating behavior. I think partially because like mating is going to be how your genes are passed on. But I think they also just, unfortunately, some evolutionary psychologists like to use evolutionary psychology to justify cultural sex differences, if that makes sense, and I'll kind of explain as we go in here. So mate selection is what you look for in your mate. And again, I'm going to give a little preface here that these are going to be super heteronormative, right? Which is already problematic when we know so many individuals in our society and so many animals worldwide have instances of homosexuality, right? But these are very heteronormative. So mate selection is what you look for specifically in the opposite sex. And the argument is men place a higher value on physical attractiveness and prefer younger mates, and that is reproductively driven. That men want to select widely, that they want to get a sperm to an egg at every opportunity. And they think that physically attractive younger mates are more likely to be able to give birth without complications. Women place higher value on economic security and prefer older mates. The idea is that women select their mates wisely. They must be careful, they must make sure they will be provided for. Now, obviously, this is problematic not only given the non-traditional relationships in our society, but also that over 50% of households now have a sole female or co-female and male or co-female and female, right, whatever have you, breadwinner. All right, so like this doesn't really apply in a lot of instances. So the idea, though, within evolutionary psych is that both want the highest likelihood of healthy offspring who will survive and reproduce, so that not only are you passing on your genes to your offspring, but they'll continue to pass them on down. The difference is in how this goal is pursued and achieved. So again, female attractiveness is seen as signaling youth and physical health, and fertility, essentially, your ability to have children, and that males need to provide economic resources and appropriate attitudes to support a family. Now, what about mating strategies? And that's how you handle, again, specifically heterosexual relationships. Again, differences here that they argue exist between men and women. And these can include the desired number of sexual partners, how faithful you'll be to your partner, how selective you are about your partners, and the experience of sexual jealousy. And so what they argued and what some research has shown is that men report they would be more upset at sexual infidelity and women would be more upset at emotional infidelity. If you're not familiar with emotional infidelity, it's like having like a really intimate, emotional, like sharing letters and hanging out with someone. But really interestingly, 55% of men think they would be more upset by imagining their partner falling in love with someone else than by imagining their partner in different sexual positions with someone else. 88% of women said that as well. But that suggests that, like, yes, more men may report they're more upset at sexual infidelity, but the majority of men say they'd be more upset at emotional infidelity, right? So we need to make sure we're looking at this data in all the different ways. And then we look at things like factors that influence and affect reproductive success. So again, this idea is that men want to have as many children as possible and not waste time taking care of children that their own, right? It's the song Gold Digger. That's what comes into my head, right? 18 years old, right? They found out it wasn't even his. And then women are trying to find a man to help support them and the children. Now, here is the most Freudian part of evolutionary psychology. It's gross in my opinion, but we're gonna roll with it until I'll tell you about it. The sexy son hypothesis explains an alternative mating strategy for women. That mating with an attractive but unstable male will produce sexier sons who will be more likely to reproduce. Like a reverse Electra complex, right? Yeah. I mean, it's kind of Freud's idea about how to resolve penis envy, right? Like, you get over penis envy by giving birth to a male child that has the phallus, right? You ensure your mating by giving birth to a sexy. I think it's just gross to like think of your child as sexy. I don't know. So yeah, again, some crazy ideas, and again, obviously not all evolutionary psychologists would buy into all of these. There are some complications. Obviously, I've been kind of hinting at some of these as we go through, right? Right now, we know, and honestly, for the past, 50 years maybe, since the like late 60s, early 70s, the aesthetic, the ideal for women has been to be thin, right? And there's variations of that thin. Like in the 60s, 70s, it was Twiggy, who was like very straight up and down. In the 80s, it was like the supermodels like Cindy Crawford, who were like curvy, but also really skinny, right? In the 90s, you had heroin chic, Kate Moss, again, kind of looked like Twiggy all over again. Then we got the Kardashians, right? Were skinny, but voluptuous in certain places. And now the Kardashians are getting their BBLs out, apparently, which are Brazilian butt lifts, if people don't know. So now it's back to more of like this heroin chic aesthetic, but they're all skinny, right? And one of the problems is we know that women who are too thin cannot have children. And in fact, if you are far too thin, you just will not menstruate. And we know that you need to be ovulating, right? In order to actually get pregnant. So that is something that can obviously complicate it, and obviously not every woman conforms to the ideal, right? But it's just sort of, if you think about this from a body image perspective, which is where I approach from, it's interesting to think about. Attraction is also influenced by more than physical characteristics. We know that, a lot of people say, well, I love my partner because they make me laugh, right? Or they support me when I'm down, On Wednesday, I was so distressed, I forgot to bring myself a lunch, and I teach from like 9 to 2:15 straight. My husband had taken the day off, so he brought me one, right? Like, that's lovely. Male physical attractiveness is also more important to women than it should be under these theories, right? Unless we go to Sexy Son. But like, we know that women care about how their partners look as well as men do. And then this was my favorite. This was a Newbery quote, my graduate personality professor. And he said, if men want to have kids and pass on their genes, shouldn't they go along with the program, right? Evolutionary psychology kind of says men are inclined to act like assholes, right? But they should want to do or be what women want them to be, or they won't be allowed to pass on their genes because women won't select them. This is happening, I believe, in Japan. I don't know if folks have heard about this. It's like called the 4B. And like women are just like, no, we're not gonna have sex. We're not gonna have kids. And there are some women who, after the election results, are talking about that here, right? If you take evolutionary psych to the extreme, the idea is that like Men should just be spending all their time having sex with different women so they can just knock up as many of them as they can, right? And like, that's not what they're doing. And a lot of times men don't want women to get pregnant, right? Things along those lines. If men, and the other thing about it is like risky behaviors, right? If men are in the hospital or the morgue or rejected because they're players, then they won't be too successful at passing on their genes. So what about individual differences? Well, in evolutionary psych, they focus more on general human nature, not individual differences. But they do argue, okay, individual differences exist, so there must be an evolutionary reason for those individual differences to exist. One is that diversity is necessary for viability, that different traits and behaviors may be more adaptive in specific situations. So if you live in a really fraught time, being anxious or neurotic might actually be really adaptive. This makes me think of, I had this National Guardsman. If you're not familiar with the National Guard, they can kind of like be called up whenever. This guy had been sent on like 4 or 5 tours to Iraq already, and they were getting ready to send him again. And he had really bad PTSD. And he told me, look, they're sending me back. And like, I need my PTSD over there because the hypervigilance keeps me alive. And I was like, yeah, ethically, I don't feel like I can treat this right now, right? So I was unfortunately going to be gone here, actually, but when he got back, he said, please come back, please find another therapist and get it treated when you are all done. We also know that openness to experience can be really great for things like the arts and different types of exercise, but it can be really maladaptive when it's things like trying different illegal substances that might have harmful effects on you. We also say that behavioral patterns evolved as reactions to particular environmental experiences. So different environments might result in different behavioral patterns or traits. So one of the examples here is that, I think we might have mentioned this when we talked about individualistic versus collectivist cultures, is in China, just based on the environment, they needed to form agriculture for food. Like they needed to work together to build like aqueducts and big rice fields. And so that might have led to collectivism. Whereas in places in Europe, like let's say Germany, it was heavily wooded. It would have been more difficult to be more of an agrarian culture. And it became more individual, focused on hunting things like deer, right? In order to feed your family and maybe gathering. So that's more individualistic, and that may have influenced the culture, how it formed. They also say several possible behavioral strategies to a specific environment may have evolved, and that each individual would only have one of those, but it would be equally adaptive, right? You think of like, let's say there's a fence, right? There are multiple ways to get over the fence if you need to, right? You can climb it. If there's a space at the bottom, you can go under it. If you're really smart, you can just look for the gate and go through there, right? But all of them are going to get you the same goal of getting over that barrier, right? And some behaviors may be frequency dependent. They'll adjust according to how common they are. So some behaviors are adaptive as long as only a few people do them. So the example in my notes here is con artists, right? We know there's been all kinds of con artists over the years, and they sometimes do really, really well. But as more people do them, they become less effective. I think of the like Nigerian prince emails that went around in like the aughts and the teens. So if you're not familiar with this, you are blessed. But there would be these spam emails you would get, be like, I'm a Nigerian prince and I'm going to give you all this money. And at first, some people really fell for it, right? And now people are just immediately like, no, that's clearly a scam, right? So like when people did it too much, word got around. So human nature is flexible, and that we're really good at adapting to specific situations in the moment. As you all know, I tend to be like a really supportive, right, fairly warm person. But I was editor-in-chief of my college newspaper when I was in college. And I remember one time the network went down when we're trying to like get the paper to bed. And I just immediately was like, okay, you go do this and you go into the basement to this computer and you do this and I'm gonna go here. And then like 5 minutes later, I was like, what just happened? And like one of my co-editors was like, that was impressive. That was like not very you, but like it's what we needed. So we figure stuff out in the moment, right? So will biology replace psychology? No, they need to work in concert, obviously, right? There is this idea of biological reductionism that everything about the brain and the mind can be explained to biology, reduced to biology. We don't know enough about biology to make this even remotely possible, right? The brain is one of our like unexplored frontiers still. And biology would also leave out most of psychology. All those environmental influences, all of the psychological things, right? And it doesn't ask or answer many important psychological questions like, what are people thinking? How are people influenced by the environment, including by other people, right? If we think about observational learning, things along those lines. Alrighty, cool. I got through it all. I talked pretty fast. So on Monday, what we're going to do is we'll have a discussion day, but also an activity day to kind of illustrate some of the principles of behavioral genetics and evolutionary psych. And then, like I said, Wednesday is your exam completion day. And then a week from today, I'm at the conference, so you'll have 2 days without class in a row. Little break before we dive in to the reacting activities. Awesome, everybody have a good weekend.